Hey, thank you guys so much for coming. We're going to be covering a lot of detail within this next 50 minutes, so I encourage any questions at any time. There's going to be a lot, so feel free to interject. I know there's going to be a Q&A at the end, but if anybody's dying to get that question off their chest, definitely feel free to let me know. So this is, you used to call me on my shell phone. Essentially, this is Windows shellcode development for beginners. And essentially, the whole motivation about this was coming from a stunt that happened a little over a 6-month period. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the motivation behind that here shortly. But first off, a little bit about who I am, why you should listen to me. And so essentially, I got 5 years of REVR experience. And for those who are not familiar with REVR, that's reverse engineering and vulnerability research. Primarily before that, I was focused on red team ops for a couple different defense agencies, as well as a state entity as well, securing school districts. And I also spent my time doing a little bit of purple teaming before I dove headfirst into security research. Currently, I work primarily for a government contractor known as Dark Wolf. I see my guys over there. I'm also a half-time red teamer, but most of my time spent performing vulnerability research. I'm also a business owner. I also have a cybersecurity company that I run on the side. I contract out, I secure small and local businesses in Tampa, Florida. Also, I work with influencers and athletes to protect their digital footprints as well. Also, recently, over the past couple months, I've gotten into signals intelligence, and I'm kind of becoming a little bit of an RF nerd. So getting back to that motivation on why I created, you used to call me on my shell phone. So as you can clearly see, I do like Drake a little bit. Yeah, it's a little bit basic, but hey, we can't knock good music. So like I was saying, this was curated from a 6-month research effort, and pretty much one thing that I realized that stood out to me is this should not have been as difficult as it ended up being. So what I want, my biggest goal with actually creating a blog on this and blasting this out here and having this opportunity to come to you guys is I want to create and unlock a new standard coming forward, so that way we can help beginners and security researchers going forward in order to create this new standard, so we can make this easy and this pathway a very much more successful and accessible segue into security research, especially for Windows. So I worked primarily on the Linux side before doing desktop exploitation on the Windows side, and I thought, oh, okay, well, going from Linux to Windows, this should be a cakewalk, right? Yeah, I was wrong. So, I couldn't have been more wrong about that, and the main reason is because we have to perform dynamic memory resolving at runtime whenever we're working with the Windows API, and that's what unlocks a plethora of different malicious or potentially malicious WinAPI functions that we can leverage within our shellcode before we can do anything malicious, unlike in Linux where we can just directly call syscalls. So ultimately, this whole research effort, there's a slight learning curve. I would rate the difficulty moderate, and really the only thing that made this difficult was the accessibility to this type of research and documentation wasn't as quality as I wished it was, and it definitely wasn't beginner-friendly by any means. So going forward, who's this talk for? And if you recognize that magic conch, that's from SpongeBob from a couple years ago. I'm sure you guys all remember that. That's because we're going to be using our shellcode that I'm going to teach you guys about in order to exploit a real-world app, and we're going to actually get a reverse shell. So this talk is specifically targeting penetration testers, security researchers, and pretty much anybody interested in the offensive and defensive realms of cybersecurity. A couple prerequisites for you guys. Cybersecurity or an offensive background is definitely going to help you out with this. A strong willingness to learn, be curious. I really want you guys to learn as much as you can about this. And like I said earlier, if you guys have any questions about anything, we're going to be going through a lot, so just feel free to interject at any time. Some key learning objectives, I'm just gonna run through these. So really what I want you to walk away from this is to be able to, confidently understand Windows shellcode, understand the anatomy of it, how it works, and how you can actually use that on red team engagements on your own, and bring these ideas to your team as well. I also want you to be able to intuitively understand shellcode, and that's where the main basis of this research actually comes from. And ultimately what I want you to do is I want you to be able to walk away from this and perform some security research on the Windows side on your own comfortably. And you can always reach out to me. I have my socials as well that you guys can reach out on. I'm pretty much on every platform. So really what you want to do is also on GitHub, you can go ahead, and that's at the resources slide at the end of this. You can feel free to go ahead and check that out. That's what the blog that's associated with this, that goes much more in depth. But really a couple things that you're gonna need to do is you're just gonna have to prep a Windows environment that's pretty much a throwaway so you can execute and detonate some shellcode within it. So getting into the fun stuff, what is shellcode and why is it relevant to security research? So shellcode essentially at its peak is a piece of machine code that's written in assembly language. So think of it as a microprogram that's typically ran by attackers and hackers after a software vulnerability has been exploited. And for example, like a buffer overflow bug that is a memory corruption-based vulnerability. So what can shellcode do? So shellcode can do pretty much anything that you want. The cool thing about this is really you're limited only to your creativity. So the attackers can literally do whatever they want within the realm of the shellcode itself. They can execute a shell. They can they can get a reverse or bind shell. They can open up a backdoor to set up persistence. They can create a loader sort of shellcode so that way they can actually set up some persistence, call back to a C2 server, obtain some malware, and perform privilege escalation, and a whole bunch more. How is shellcode delivered to a target? Primarily, we're going to be focusing on 1 and 2, which is memory corruption bugs like string format vulnerabilities, as well as buffer overflows, and network-based delivery, which I'm going to be applying a real-world example to at the end of this. So where does shellcode actually come from? It sounds pretty mythical. It sounds really cool. Where does it actually come from? So there's I broke this down into 2 primary realms. So the first one is actually, hackers can go out, they can develop their own shellcode within assembly language, and they can link it, they can compile it, and then what they can use is they can use a utility binary known as object dump that essentially they can carve out their core instructions within the assembly, and they can obtain a byte array that can be used in a series of different programs such as a C or a C++ loader that can be used to rapidly triage and test your shellcode implementation right then and there. So that's the first way. The second way is generating it via MSF Venom. That's Metasploit's actual exploitation framework. You can obtain it from a third party such as ExploitDB, Shellstorm, GitHub, etc. Now, that is definitely the most convenient, unlike the first where it takes a little bit of time because of development. However, both of these come with a couple different caveats that we want to keep in mind. So the first one is going to be the most stealthiest approach. This is, for obvious reasons, it's going to come from a custom implementation, a custom development, and it is going to be time consuming though, but oftentimes you're probably not going to get signatured by AVs and EDR defenses. So that's really good, but you do have the time-consuming aspect of it. Now, the second is going to be the most convenient, but who's to say that shellcode isn't already compromised and backdoored? You don't know exactly what you're running, so definitely be careful about that. And you can actually see at the bottom of the screen, just what it looks like as a byte array. And the first black picture is actually just obtaining that from MSF Venom. So how does Windows shellcode differ from Linux shellcode? So this was the biggest learning curve that I had to battle last year whenever I was tackling this exact issue. And it's actually quite simple. So with Windows, unlike Linux, we're going to be utilizing a different calling convention. So there is no usage of a syscall instruction or direct access to syscall numbers via dynamic syscall resolution. This is because Windows relies entirely on the Windows API. This way, by granting us access to the Windows API in memory, this allows us to unlock a series of different functions like winexec, create process A, load library, you name it, and that'll unlock a plethora of different capabilities for us to be able to carry out our malicious actions. So, like I said, these API functions, they have to be resolved at runtime, and that is why if you actually put side by side Windows and Linux shellcode together, that you can actually see in the bottom right-hand corner. So with Windows shellcode, that implementation is much, much larger than Linux shellcode, and that's byte-size different as well as logic implementation. That is because on the Windows side, before you can actually do anything malicious, you have to dynamically resolve all of these functions that you actually want to use. And the cool thing about that is it sounds scary at first, but you can actually rely on the same technique over and over again. And that is why I created this, because I thought that was just so awesome. So a little bit of background, what are processes and threads? So this is going to be a little bit crucial just to understand, exactly why shellcode works. So processes at its core is just a program or an application that's running in user land. It calls out to the kernel, and all that it's asking for is, hey, we need space to run X, Y, and Z program. And a thread, on the other hand, is just a small subset and context of execution of small instructions, and it's independent to its own process. So what actually, a little bit of subnotes about threads is that each individual thread has its own TLS or thread local storage. That's a whole talk on its own, but that's a little bit outside the scope. We're going to be talking about the PEB and the TEB, or the process environment block and the thread environment block. So just keep this in mind. So these can get really in-depth, but think of them as internal Windows API data structures that constantly exist in memory, and there are a series of PEBs and TEBs that exist congruently within memory space for each function or each program as well as each thread. So think about it like this. So the TEB will always point to the PEB. That is because a thread is always going to point to a corresponding process, and all a PEB is actually doing is it just holds information and context about that individual process running in user land. And then the TEB is actually responsible for holding on to information about that specific thread. And so one thing that we can remember is the way that shellcode works, like I was saying earlier, before we can actually implement any malicious behaviors, what we have to do is we have to load the modules that are actually loaded within our target processes. That is done by iterating through the PEB, and then by walking through the PEB, we can actually access the loader member that's associated with the PEB data structure, and then that loader member is actually a pointer to what's known as a linked list called in-memory order module list. And this is going to point to a linked list of all of the modules that are, or DLLs that are loaded within our current target process. And that's what unlocks things like kernel32.dll. And once we locate where we are in memory, we can start resolving functions like getProcAddress or winexec, and that is the cool thing. So it sounds scary at first, but if you just do the same thing over and over again, you can actually incorporate the same logic every single time in your malicious shellcode, and you can just build off of it and focus on your malicious aspect immediately after just walking through the process environment block. So a couple things that you're going to actually run into during this type of research is you're going to be battling some undocumented structures. One of the craziest learning curves was definitely being able to understand the process environment block internal data structure. That is because this is a proprietary Windows structure. Windows, as we all know, is a proprietary OS. It's not open source like Linux is. So I found this very interesting, and the whole reason why Windows actually makes some of their documentation private is because Windows internals is going to be comprised of various different undocumented functions and Windows internal structures, so that way they can protect users and they can actually make it a harder time for hackers and attackers or researchers like me. And let me go back really quick. So yeah, taking, for example, so the PEB structure, you can actually see, if you see in red, it says reserved. That is actually part of the undocumented procedure and aspect that Windows is actually implementing. So breaking apart shellcode, what does it actually look like visually to a human? So there's three primary parts to shellcode. So like I said, you have our assembly code, and this is going to contain our dynamic memory resolving implementation that I was talking about earlier, as well as our malicious implementation as well. Immediately after that, we can obtain a byte array, and that's performed by linking and compiling and carving it out using object dump, and we can use that using a compiler and a linker like NASM, for example. And once we actually obtain that byte array, we can keep that original exe that we just created for our shellcode, and we could use that for malware, or we can carve it out with that byte array, like I said, and put that into a loader, which you can see in the corner right there, which is loader.cpp. So the beauty of that is you can actually keep that same logic, and where that buffer is for shellcode, you can actually put in your byte array right there and easily and rapidly test out your shellcode. So how does dynamic WinAPI function address resolving actually work? So at a high level, this is what is occurring in memory every single time that you execute your shellcode. So at a high level, you have your shellcode, and then the second is you're going to be iterating through the process environment block, and what you're going to be doing is you're going to be locating kernel32.dll, because that is holding on to our core malicious functions that we can unlock to do whatever we want and carry out our goals for our mission. And we do that by walking the PEB, and that is exactly what that technique is called. So after we walk the PEB, we can go through loader, which is that pointer to in-memory module lists, and that will actually unlock a series of various different modules that we can pick from. We can access that like kernel32.dll, and inside that module, we can go ahead and we can start picking out and dynamically resolving those functions and use them in our shellcode. And then after we do that, we can simply call something like winexec cmd.exe and get a reverse shell. So yeah, this is quite a crazy picture, like a slide. But if you want to take a picture of this, or if you have GitHub, definitely check out my GitHub. I have all the slides on this. But really, this is the core overall implementation of how this works at the shellcode or assembly level. So the first thing that you're going to be doing is what you want to do is, in order to walk the PEB and find these various different data structures, what you want to do is you want to find the base address of kernel32.dll. Immediately after, you want to find the export table or the IAT, which is going to hold on to our core functions that we want to actually find in memory. And we can use that by accessing that list, from that linked list that's pointed to by loader and the PEB data structure. And that's going to allow us to resolve functions within kernel32.dll. Immediately after that, we can use getProcAddress, which we can actually correspond to find other functions within kernel32.dll. And we can actually resolve any function we want immediately after that. So how do we actually know where the PEB and their functions are all the time? Because like I said earlier, we can rely on the same technique every single time, but thinking back, isn't memory volatile? Isn't it changing all the time? Well, here's the beauty of that. You actually don't, because since it's relying on a Windows data structure, these offsets aren't going to change at all every single time with every single execution. So TLDR, this is a technique that we can always rely on. We can put this for our malicious implementation, and we can actually rely on this to resolve any runtime addresses at any time. So walking through this at a high level, in order to develop shellcode and make it actually do malicious things for attackers, what we need to do is we need to first dynamically resolve addresses utilizing the PEB. Like I said, that's walking the PEB. And that's going to allow us to unlock a handbook, which is essentially that linked list to access all those modules, which opens up a plethora of different functions that we can have. Then we can rely on a simple equation that I like to call, and what we can do is we can just rely on this and programmatically implement this within our assembly every single time in order to resolve these functions. So simply put, this is PEB plus hex C which will grant us DLL base, and that'll point to our kernel32.dll or other module that we want to specify, and that'll give us our base for kernel32.dll. So putting it all together, it's DLL base minus in-memory order links, and that's going to give us hex 18, and like I said, these are never going to change, so we can programmatically do that every single time in assembly. Minus hex 8 is going to give us hex 10, and that's going to allow us to constantly and reliably allow us to resolve functions within kernel32.dll. And in the illustrations, we can actually see that hex C, or the loader member that's associated with the linked list, everything that points to the linked list in memory modules, is always going to be hex C. It's always going to, we can always rely on that, so we never have to change our overall memory resolving implementation every time. We can simply copy and paste this and then implement our malicious procedures within our shellcode after that. So just to nerd out a little bit, I think this is really cool. This is just some basic computer science stuff, but perspective really is everything. So, you know, why would we want to do something in, you know, assembly and write 120 lines with the same thing that we can do in C in under 5 lines? Well, it's actually really simple. So on the C representation, we have clear API usage. We have winexec cmd.exe, and all it's doing is it's just going to return, and it's going to grant us that reverse shell. This is very easy to understand as humans, but ultimately we have less control of explicitly going through and telling the CPU what we want it to do. However, on the other side, we have assembly, and that whole screenshot right there is 120 lines to take it to do what it does in assembly versus what it takes to do in C in 3 lines. So yes, it is a little bit more convoluted, but we have maximum control of telling the computer exactly what we want it to do. So whenever you're developing shellcode, a couple more things that you're going to have to know and have some knowledge on, especially whenever you're developing it yourself, is you're going to have to understand how registers work. So at a high level, registers work by having two distinctions. So you have special purpose registers that actually have like one specific purpose and special purpose, and you also have general purpose registers. So starting with special purpose registers, we have EAX and RAX, and if it begins with an E, the easiest way to remember is that's 32-bit or x86, and if it begins with an R, that's 64 or x64. So EAX and RAX, that is going to store our return values. So that commonly holds return values that are returned from WinAPI functions, and it can also be used to temporarily switch in and out various different pointers as well. EIP and RIP are going to be very important. This is actually our instruction pointer. So whatever instruction is actually being pointed at in this register, that is going to be the next instruction that's executed by our CPU. So if we sneak some malicious code in there that's being pointed to at that address, we're then going to be able to divert the flow of execution to do whatever we want the computer to do. This is very important to know because shellcode is position independent in memory, so it can pretty much execute anywhere. And then going into general purpose registers, yes, there's quite a bit. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of them, but really just know that like XS, so anything with SI or DI, that's pretty much the source index or the destination index for where buffers are going to be stored or sent data to or from during memory operations. So getting into the fun stuff, building your first shellcode, really what I want to just break down is taking this as, you know, as many baby steps as possible and writing a simple message box using the WinAPI in assembly. So why wouldn't we just skip to the fun stuff? Why don't we want to just jump straight into a reverse shell? So message box A is actually a perfect beginner payload because you don't have to worry about anything being in network byte order. You don't have to worry about, you know, networking in general. All it's doing is just making a simple WinAPI call, passing some parameters, and as long as you structure your assembly correctly, this is going to execute properly every single time, no matter what. Unless if you're executing or exploiting a vulnerability, then you might not be properly structuring your exploit out. But like I said, this is going to allow you to get that instant gratification every single time we do successfully exploit and execute your shellcode. And that way you can go ahead and you can pass this same logic on to something like a reverse shell because you tested this out and you confirmed, hey, my exploit is actually working. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run through this little demo. I actually did this talk earlier with my company internally, and I did it live, and it worked like a gem. But I'm not going to go through all of the demo god drama this time. So yeah, so what we can see is I have a message box A implementation, and I'm pretty much just showing you the source code of that. And then pretty soon after I show you all the logic behind that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to link and I'm going to compile that. And then immediately after that, I'm going to carve out the binary, obtain that byte string array. And then we can go ahead and we can put that into or we can just simply execute our exe that we just linked and compiled. And then we can go back, we can go to my C code. That's going to hold on to my C loader. And then I'm going to show you my C loader implementation and logic. We can put that same byte array into that array right there, and we can go ahead and we can execute that. And of course, I messed up the demo, but give it a second. And you're going to see message box A actually pop up right here. So boom, there you go. So now that we know that that's working, we can go ahead and we can do something even cooler. Now, before I want to get into the cool stuff, a couple things that you are going to run into for sure, especially whenever you're just beginning writing shellcode. I call these little like pitfalls and some gotchas. So there's going to be compatibility issues. I can't tell you, this is so embarrassing, but I can't tell you how many times I actually used the wrong compiler to compile my x64 shellcode for my x86 binary that I'm trying to exploit. And for hours, I was trying to debug exactly why it would work until, I got smart enough to say, hey, I have a debugger. Let's actually just pop this in the debugger and see what registers are being accessed. But simply put, if you're exploiting a 64-bit target or a 64-bit target, then you want to use 64-bit shellcode or assembly, and you want to make sure that you compile that using the correct compiler as well. And if you're exploiting a x86 binary, then you want to use x86 shellcode as well. Now, why is this? This is because x86 and 64-bit have different calling conventions. So for x86, you have standard call, and all that means is from right to left, your parameters of your functions are going to be stored on the stack. And with fast call, your parameters for your functions are going to be stored directly in CPU registers. Also, if you've worked with exploits in the past, you probably know what null bytes and bad characters are. Pretty much they fall under the same exact thing, except null bytes are always going to be hex 00. Bad characters are pretty much going to be anything like \n, \r. It can be a whole bunch of other unique characters as well, and you can find that out just by working through and debugging your shellcode. But essentially, all of them result because of a C-based environment that they're actually operating in. So this can actually truncate your shellcode entirely, terminate it early, and that means that your exploit is not going to be working as intended. So making sure that you strip out your shellcode and your byte array of these bad characters if they're not supported in your environment is going to be very important. Also, we have NOPslides. So NOPslides are no operation instructions, and all it is just a series of NOPs that are stacked on top of each other, and this creates what's known as a NOPsled. So you can think of something like a landing pad for your CPU. So oftentimes whenever we successfully exploit a vulnerability, we don't know exactly where we're going to be ending up in memory, and we also might run into some misalignment issues as well, depending on what kind of architecture you're actually exploiting. So with NOPslides, you can actually reliably gauge where you're going to land in memory, and you can also think of it as absorbing imprecision, and you can actually use it to pad memory out. Also, like I said earlier, you're going to run into some size constraints or some misalignment issues. We can reliably use NOPs to go ahead and pad that out, so that way we can make sure that our exploit and everything in memory is aligned properly. So for a real-world application, I wanted to go ahead and I wanted to show you guys what a reverse shell is going to look like compared to a message box A. And right here, I'm not exploiting anything yet. I'm not applying the REVR methodology. All I'm doing is I'm just writing a reverse shell, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you what that looks like. So this is actually not exploiting a vulnerability right here. This is just running a simple reverse shell. So we can see the implementation on the right-hand side. We can actually grab it just using a C loader, put that in, and you can see I get a reverse shell right in my Kali box right there. So using everything that we learned, what we can now do is we can apply what we've learned to the REVR methodology and actually begin performing some vulnerability research on a real-world target. So I didn't want to pick anything too insane about this. I'm sure you guys have heard of Vuln server in the past. There's all kinds of challenges about it, but I think it's a perfect example to actually apply all of this logic to, because we can actually perform vulnerability discovery. We can begin to understand the vulnerability. We can perform exploit development on that vulnerability so we can weaponize it and be able to carry out our goals for it. And we can obtain a reverse shell, for example. So walking you through, I actually have a whole guide on this within my blog, so go ahead and check that out as well. So that way you can understand how we found this vulnerability. But basically at a high level, what's great about this is an open source binary, so you can find it right on GitHub. So looking through and triaging the entire source code for various different bugs, we can actually see a memory corruption bug that's existent within function 3. And all function 3 is it's actually going to be a void type, and it's going to have a char star input. So we're going to be able to put some input within our, we're going to be able to pass some input into this function right here. And we can immediately see a char buffer2s, and that's going to store 2,000 bytes of information. And you can actually see immediately after that, we don't actually have any bounds checking logic within there. So that means that we're actually going to be able to use that parameter, char star input. And since it's going to be stored with the stir copy, we can actually send as much information as we want without any bounds checking. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow us to be able to exploit a buffer overflow vulnerability. So I'm going to walk you through that right here. So so as a vulnerability researcher, one thing that we like to do is we like to fuzz things. So that's utilizing randomly mutated strings and inputs to send as much data at something just to see if it behaves incorrectly. So immediately what we can see is, I'm just showing you the overall logic for that. I'm going to send a length of 2001 bytes, which, thinking back during the vulnerability discovery, we can see that our buffer was only developed to handle up to 2,000 bytes. So walking through my debugger, we can actually go ahead and we can check to see if our instruction pointer or if our return value is actually overwritten. And by dumping memory at those specific regions, we can actually see a series of 4 ones. However, we did not successfully overwrite EIP. We just overwritten the return address. That means that we're off to the right start. That just means that we get to send more data, so that way we can overwrite the instruction pointer. And at this run right here, we're going to be able to see that EIP is going to point to hex 4141, which is capital A in memory, which is what we're actually fuzzing for. We're just sending a whole bunch of A's as input. And you can see that hex 41 has now overwritten our instruction pointer. And they're coming up as question marks because the CPU doesn't know exactly, that's not actual valid memory. So going through and exploiting this vulnerability, we can actually use some logic that we learned from our fuzzing experience. We can use a NOPsLIDE as well. We can start a netcat listener on our Kali side. And what we can do is we can use a network-based vulnerability, since this is like a messaging app or server. And we can go ahead and we can exploit this vulnerability over the network and capture a reverse shell over the network with a netcat listener. So I'm going to start my netcat listener right there, kick off my vulnerability or my exploit. and I had to do a little bit of black magic because I am on a ARM Mac. So yeah, if you are curious about how I was able to exploit an x86 binary on an ARM Mac, definitely let me know. I actually had to write my own encoder for Metasploit for the SGN encoder. That was crazy. So it was tons of fun. I got to learn a lot about it. But yeah, so as you can see, I have a reverse shell utilizing all of the information that we learned from this chat. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you guys had fun. Thank you guys so much. If you guys have any questions, definitely feel free to come up. There's a resources section right here. I'm on Instagram, YouTube, pretty much everywhere. I'm on LinkedIn as well, pretty heavy. And feel free to take a picture of the resources slide as well. I'm OXXYC on GitHub, so definitely look me up.
So before I ask my question, I just want to make sure I understand what kind of what you were explaining about how functions get resolved at runtime. So this involves an import address table, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
So that table gets populated with pointers to run DLL or any function that we need for that program. Is that correct?
Correct.
If I'm not, what I'm thinking is, how is that not? And you were saying, because this is always static every time in Windows, you can recreate this process everywhere. My question to you is, how is that not a security vulnerability where you can now reliably just use this information over and over and over again? Why did Windows, and you might not know the answer to this, but why did Windows choose to do this?
So I think that's a great idea. Honestly, I think I hate to even say this, but I think it's more of a feature. And the fact that I think Microsoft, the way that they developed this is, I think they were just thinking about this in terms of just code reusability every single time, and the fact that they would have to be battling various defenses like ASLR every single time, and that would take up crucial, efficient execution moments in terms of the CPU. So I think that they were just, using this as like inherent risk, and they were just accepting the fact that this could probably happen. But also we got to keep in mind that, you actually have to be on the box itself for this to actually run locally. So it's not like you can do this remotely and arbitrarily. However, that's why shellcode is like so good post-compromise. However, if it was the opposite, then we would run into a much bigger issue as well.
Okay.
Hopefully
Cool.
that answers your question.
Yes.
I don't think that's I'm not saying that's confirmed, but that's just my thoughts on that. That's a really good question.
Okay. And so my follow-up question on that is, how does Linux work differently when it comes to this, the same kind of scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me go back. Let me find it. Okay. So you can actually see, so Windows shellcode and versus Linux shellcode. So Windows shellcode is going to be much, much larger in size, in byte size compared to Linux shellcode. That is because we have to dynamically resolve all of our addresses before we can do anything malicious. So on Linux, we can actually just simply use the syscall instruction, and you can actually see that we're actually popping a hex 80. We're actually using hex 80, which is the syscall instruction, and we're using that with a corresponding, using Linux documentation, a corresponding address that points to a syscall within Linux, and we're able to just directly call that every single time. Whereas with Windows, we can't do that. We can't rely on a syscall instruction. We actually have to walk the PEB. We have to resolve these instructions at these functions at runtime in order to leverage them.
And I think you were mentioning that Windows keeps some of their documentation closed source.
Absolutely.
Because, well, I guess the opposite logic is true. Linux is open source, so we can just look at the source code to get exactly where we're wanting to go, versus Windows, which some of it's closed source. We're not able to do that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And really the whole motivation behind Microsoft making that decision is to close off and make this much more harder for reverse engineers and vulnerability researchers.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? If not,
Don't be shy.
don't be shy. Come on over.
What's up, Jacob? Long
Hey,
time.
I know you.
Yep, I know you too. So I'm noticing using the WinAPI calls, and if you're talking about how you want to use syscalls in Linux, I'm curious as to why you're hooking onto kernel 32 instead of NTDLL and using the NT syscalls, since WinAPI ones are literally just wrappers around it.
Absolutely. So a lot of threat actors use NTDLL, and because it has a bunch of wrappers around it, I just wanted to do it a little bit differently because I was going through the learning process and just to show that, we can do this a couple different ways. And that's really it.
Plus NT, you do have less AV scrutiny.
Absolutely. Hey,
How are you doing?
good. How are you?
Okay, so my question is about NOPslides, and honestly, I just appreciate the way you think about and explain things. Can you just talk about your logic behind sizing and how you make that choice and what goes into sizing a NOPslide?
Wait, I'm sorry. Could you repeat that last part?
Just your logic behind how you size a NOPslide on a given engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes we're going depending on where we actually land at in memory. That isn't going to be sufficient enough to where we actually need to begin overwriting the return address and the instruction pointer. So what we can do is we can measure out using a debugger to see where we're actually landing prior to implementing a NOPslide within our exploit code, and we can actually just, trial and error and just rinse and repeat. We can actually just see, by slowly incrementing our NOPslide over time. And because all we have to do is we can use multiplication to stack and Python to stack hex 90 a bunch of times together in a byte array or something similar, and we can create that NOPslide, and we can actually append that to our shellcode using Python, and we can actually see just how incrementally closer we're getting to overwriting those registers that we actually care about.